The Christmas dinner was supposed to be perfect, but my mother threw my adopted daughter's handmade gift aside, sneering that she only accepted presents from real family. She didn't expect my 15-year-old son to stand up, reveal a devastating family secret, and shatter their legacy forever. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The silence in the dining room wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of suffocating quiet that happens right after a car crash, just before the screaming starts. I sat at the mahogany table, my knuckles white as I gripped the linen napkin in my lap. The scent of roasted duck and pine needles, usually so comforting on Christmas Eve, now made my stomach turn. I looked at my daughter, Zoe. She was 11 years old, small for her age, with big, dark eyes that usually held a spark of creative mischief. Tonight, those eyes were wide and glossy, fixed on the floor. At her feet lay the gift she had spent 3 weeks making. It was a hand-painted ceramic bowl, fired in the kiln at her school, wrapped lovingly in silver paper that was now torn and crumpled on the Persian rug. My mother, Barbara, sat at the head of the table, wiping her hands on a napkin as if she had just touched something filthy. Her face was composed, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her pearls gleaming under the chandelier. She didn't look angry. She looked dismissive, cold. "I simply stated a fact, Isabella," Barbara said, her voice smooth and devoid of any maternal warmth. She took a sip of her wine. "We have traditions in this family, long-standing traditions regarding lineage. I don't take presents from kids who don't belong to this family. It feels performative." My father, Robert, sat next to her, staring intently at his plate of untouched potatoes. He was the enabler, the man who had spent 40 years smoothing over the cracks my mother caused, pretending that her cruelty was just high standards. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at Zoe. "She is your granddaughter," I whispered, my voice trembling. I wasn't sick, but I felt physically ill, a wave of nausea rolling through me that had nothing to do with the rich food. "She is part of this family." "Legally, perhaps," Barbara countered, waving a hand dismissively. "But we are talking about blood, Isabella, the purity of our line. We have a legacy to protect. You can't just paste a new branch onto an oak tree and expect it to hold." Zoe didn't cry. That was the part that broke my heart the most. She just blinked twice, slowly. She had learned in the 5 years since I adopted her that crying in front of Barbara was like bleeding in front of a shark. It only invited more attacks. She just stood there, a little statue of rejected love, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. I opened my mouth to scream, to flip the table, to do something that would get us thrown out, but I didn't get the chance. The chair next to me scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Leo, my 15-year-old son, stood up. Leo was my biological child, the heir Barbara doted on, the one she constantly bragged about to her country club friends because he had her eyes and her chin. He was usually quiet, a typical teenager who preferred his headphones to family conversation. But tonight, he looked like a giant. He walked around the table, his heavy boots thudding on the floor, until he stood directly behind Zoe. He placed both hands on her shoulders, gripping her firmly, anchoring her. "Sit down, Leo," Robert muttered, finally speaking. "Don't make a scene." Leo ignored him. He looked straight at Barbara. His face wasn't angry, it was terrifyingly calm. It was the face of someone who had been holding onto a grenade for a very long time and had just decided to pull the pin. "You talk a lot about blood, Grandma," Leo said. His voice was deep, cracking slightly but steady. "You talk a lot about who belongs and who doesn't, about the purity of this house." "I am teaching you about your heritage, Leo," Barbara said, her eyes narrowing. "You'll thank me one day." "I don't think I will," Leo replied. He paused, looking from Barbara to Robert, and then he smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Because I found the boxes in the attic, Grandma, the ones behind the insulation in the East Wing. The ones marked 1985. The color drained from Barbara's face so fast it looked like a physical blow. The wine glass in her hand wobbled, spilling a drop of red onto the white tablecloth like a gunshot wound. Robert dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the china, the sound echoing in the sudden, deadly silence. "I know," Leo said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "I know about the legacy. And I know that if we're going by your rules about blood and belonging, then you're the one who should get out of this house." The betrayal in the room wasn't just the rejection of a gift anymore. It was the sudden, violent exposure of a lifetime of lies. It hurt worse than the diagnosis I had received years ago, worse than my divorce. It was the moment the ground beneath us dissolved. The drive back to our house was a blur of passing streetlights and heavy, suffocating silence. The festive lights adorning the neighborhood houses mocked us with their cheerful blinking. Inside my SUV, the air was thick with unprocessed trauma. Zoe was buckled into the back seat, staring out the window. She still hadn't shed a tear. She was clutching the rejected ceramic bowl in her lap, her small fingers tracing the painted patterns over and over again. Every time we went over a bump, I flinched, terrified the sound of the ceramic cracking would finally shatter her composure. "Leo," I said, my voice hoarse. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. "What did you mean back there? What boxes?" Leo was in the passenger seat, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked drained, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading into teenage exhaustion. "Not now, Mom, please, I wanted her to stop. I needed her to stop looking at Zoe like that." "You scared them," I said. "I've never seen my father look like that. He looked like he was having a stroke." "Good," Leo muttered, staring at the dashboard. "They deserve it." I glanced in the rearview mirror at Zoe. "Honey, are you okay?" Zoe didn't answer immediately. When she finally turned her head, her face was a mask of adult resignation that no 11-year-old should ever have to wear. "It's okay, Mom. I knew she didn't like it. I just thought, because it was Christmas." "It is not okay," I said firmly, tears finally pricking my eyes. "What she did was cruel, it was unforgivable, and we are never, ever going back there." My phone buzzed in the cup holder, then it buzzed again, and again, a relentless stream of notifications. I waited until we pulled into our driveway before I looked. It was Barbara. Text, "You need to control your son, he is delusional." Text, "If you leave tonight, don't expect a check for the spring tuition." Text, "Bring him back, we need to discuss what he thinks he saw, he is mistaken." The sheer audacity of it made me laugh, a short, hysterical sound that startled the kids. She wasn't apologizing for crushing Zoe's heart. She was in damage control mode. She was worried about her secrets. We got inside our house, a modest, comfortable colonial that felt like a sanctuary compared to the cold museum of my parents' estate. I made hot chocolate, not because anyone wanted it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. As the kids went upstairs, Leo helping Zoe carry her things, a silent guardian, I sat at the kitchen island and stared at my phone. The screen lit up with an incoming call. "Dad." I let it go to voicemail. Then Mom, voicemail. Then, a text from a number I hadn't heard from in months. "Uncle Frank, you really messed up tonight, Izzy. Mom is distraught. You better fix this before the New Year's gala, or you're going to find yourself cut off. Leo needs to learn his place." I stared at the message. Frank, my older brother, the golden boy. I put the phone down and walked into my home office. I am a historical archivist by trade. I spend my days digging through county records, restoring old deeds, and tracing family lineages for the local historical society. I know how to find things that people think are lost. I know how to read between the lines of faded ink. Leo had mentioned boxes in the attic. Boxes marked 1985. My mind raced. 1985 was the year my grandfather died. It was the year the family fortune, which had been dwindling, suddenly revitalized, allowing my parents to buy the estate they now lived in. It was the year the legacy Barbara preached about was solidified. I looked at the text from Frank again. Leo needs to learn his place. They thought they were dealing with the daughter who just wanted to be loved. They thought they were dealing with the single mom who needed their tuition checks. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I was the one who organized their filing system 10 years ago, and I had kept copies of keys they didn't even remember existed. To understand why tonight was the breaking point, you have to understand the dynamic of the house I grew up in. I was never the favorite. That title belonged to Frank. Frank, who was 5 years older, handsome, charming, and utterly hollow. He had bounced from failed startup to failed startup, always bylaid out by my father's checkbook, always welcomed back with open arms by my mother. I, on the other hand, was the steady one, the one who got the degrees, the steady job, the one who visited every Sunday. But when I adopted Zoe, the dynamic shifted from indifference to hostility. Barbara Vi. Wed adoption as a failure of biology. She saw Zoe not as a child who needed a home, but as a contaminant in her pristine gene pool. Frank, of course, fed into this. He had moved back in with my parents 6 months ago, ostensibly to help manage the estate, but I knew better. He was broke again. His latest venture in cryptocurrency had imploded, and he was back to drain the well. Since his return, Barbara's rhetoric about blood and legacy had ramped up significantly. I suspected Frank was whispering in her ear, reminding her that if the inheritance was split 3 ways, me, Frank, and the grandkids, Zoe's share would be a waste. He wanted to consolidate the pot. He wanted Zoe out of the picture, and if that meant pushing me out too, he was fine with that. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark room. I pulled up the digitized records of the county land ownership, public access for someone with my credentials. I needed to understand what Leo saw. The phone rang again. This time I answered. Isabella, Frank's voice was smooth, patronizing. Finally, look, Mom is hyperventilating. You need to get Leo to apologize. Tell them he was making up stories to be edgy. He wasn't making it up, Frank, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I saw their faces. They were terrified. Don't be dramatic, Frank scoffed. He's a kid. He found some old tax papers or love letters and thinks he's Sherlock Holmes. Listen to me. Mom is talking about the trust. She's talking about the rewrite. The rewrite? I asked, my blood running cold. The family trust, Frank said, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She wants to amend the beneficiary clauses, specifically the definition of issue. She wants to specify biological issue only. If that happens, Zoe gets nothing, and if you fight her, she might just cut you out too. You're doing this, I hissed. You're the one pushing her. I'm just looking out for the family assets, Izzy. We can't have strangers inheriting the estate. It's not right. Now, bring the kids over tomorrow for brunch. Make Leo apologize. Make Zoe, I don't know, stay in the car or something, just fix it. He hung up. The line went dead, but the rage in my chest was just igniting. Frank wasn't just an entitled brother anymore. He was an active threat to my daughter's future. He was a polished predator in a suit, using my mother's narcissism as a weapon to secure his own payday. He stood there in that house, sipping scotch, looking at my daughter like she was an accounting error. I looked at the blank screen of my computer. Leo had found boxes from 1985. My grandfather died in 1985. My parents bought the estate in 1985. I wasn't going to brunch. I wasn't going to apologize. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf in the corner of my office. Behind a row of dusty encyclopedias was a small, locked fireproof box. I had taken it years ago when I was clearing out my grandfather's study after he passed. My parents had been too busy ordering flowers for the funeral to care about his old journals. I had never read them. I respected his privacy. But tonight, privacy was a luxury we couldn't afford. I took the key from my desk drawer. You want to talk about legacy, Mother? I whispered to the empty room. Let's see what the legacy actually is. I unlocked the box. Inside was a leather-bound journal, and a heavy, sealed envelope marked with the seal of a law firm that no longer existed. Leo had started the fire. I was about to pour gasoline on it. The envelope was heavy, the wax seal on the back cracked with age, but still holding the flap shut. My hands trembled as I used a letter opener to slice through the top. The paper inside was yellowed, smelling of cedar and old vanilla, the scent of my grandfather's study that I hadn't smelled in decades. I pulled out the contents. A handwritten letter addressed to my dearest Isabella, dated 3 days before his death in 1985, and a photostat copy of a legal document from 1952. I unfolded the letter first. My grandfather, a man I remembered as stern but fair, had written in a shaky hand, the ink blotting in places where he must have paused to rest his pen. My dear Izzy, if you are reading this, then the secrets I have kept buried for a lifetime have likely surfaced. I have instructed my attorney to give you the key to this box only if the family peace is threatened. I love your mother, but I know her nature. She is insecure, prone to vanity, and obsessed with a status that she feels she must constantly earn. I fear that after I am gone, she may lose her way. You must know the truth, not to hurt her, but to protect yourself. The estate, the trust, the very foundation of what Barbara calls her heritage, is built on a lie she has told herself so many times she believes it. We did not have children of our own. We could not. Barbara was a gift to us from the St. Jude's Home for Children. She is my daughter in every way that matters to the heart, but she is not of my blood. And the trust created by my father, the source of the wealth she flaunts, has a very specific stipulation regarding direct biological descendants. I have hidden this truth to keep her safe, to keep the money flowing to her, but if she ever uses blood as a weapon against you or yours, you remind her where she came from. I sat back in my chair, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp rush. I looked at the second document. It was an order of adoption, dated October 14, 1952. Baby girl Doe, renamed Barbara Ann. The irony was so sharp it felt like it had physically cut me. The woman who had looked at my daughter, my beautiful, adopted daughter, and told her she didn't belong because she wasn't blood, was herself adopted. Barbara didn't just have a secret. She was living a fraudulent existence based on the very rules she used to abuse us. But it went deeper than hypocrisy. My eyes scanned the letter again. The trust has a very specific stipulation regarding direct biological descendants. If the trust that funded their lifestyle, the country club, the mansion, Frank's endless failed businesses, the spring tuition she threatened to withhold, was strictly for biological descendants of my great-grandfather, then Barbara wasn't just a hypocrite. She was a thief. She had been accessing funds she legally had no right to, likely by suppressing this adoption decree. And did Frank know? I grabbed my phone and dialed the one person I knew could help me navigate the legal minefield I had just stepped into. Sarah was a ferocious litigator and my best friend since college. It was late, almost midnight, but she answered on the second ring. Izzy, everything okay? I saw your post about the dinner. I was about to drive over there and egg their house. Don't egg the house, Sarah, I said, my voice shaking with a mix of adrenaline and terrifying clarity. I need you to look at something. I'm going to scan it and send it to you right now. It's about the Rutherford family trust. The impossible trust? Sarah asked, her tone shifting instantly to professional curiosity. The one Frank is always bragging about. The same, I said. Sarah, what happens if the primary beneficiary of a blood lineage only trust is proven to be adopted? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. If the trust language is specific, then they are liable for fraud, massive fraud. Depending on the statute of limitations, they could lose everything. The assets would technically revert to the next actual biological kin. I looked at the adoption decree on my desk. I need you to verify the language of the original 1920 trust deed. Can you do that first thing in the morning? I can do it right now, Sarah said, the sound of typing already clicking in the background. I have access to the probate archives. Give me 10 minutes. I sat in the silence of my office, the ghostly presence of my grandfather in the room with me. He had given me a weapon, a nuclear weapon, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to use it. I wasn't just the quiet archivist anymore. I was the hunter. The next morning, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unshed snow. I didn't sleep. I spent the night organizing files, printing copies, and building a timeline. At 10:00 a.m., I pulled up to the iron gates of my parents' estate. I had left Zoe and Leo with Sarah's husband. This was not a place for children. I didn't buzz the intercom. I used the old passcode, my birthday, which, surprisingly, they hadn't changed. The gates swung open with a groan. As I walked up the long, manicured driveway, I saw Frank's sports car parked haphazardly near the fountain. He was here. Good, I wanted him here. I let myself in with my key. The house smelled of stale pine and expensive cleaning products. I could hear voices in the sunroom. She's hysterical, Frank. You have to handle her. If she goes to the club talking about Leo's outburst. Barbara's voice was shrill, lacking its usual composure. She won't, Frank's voice was dismissive. Izzy doesn't have the stomach for a fight. I'll threaten to sue her for slander if she breathes a word. She's broke, Mom. She needs the tuition money. She'll fall in line. I walked into the sunroom. Barbara was sitting on the floral chaise, holding a Bloody Mary. Frank was pacing, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my car. They both froze when they saw me. Isabella, Barbara said, straightening up and putting on her mask of icy disapproval. I didn't expect you. Have you come to apologize for your son's behavior? No, I said calmly, remaining standing. I didn't take off my coat. I wanted them to know I wasn't staying. I came to return something. I reached into my bag and pulled out a photocopy of the 1952 adoption order. I placed it gently on the glass coffee table, right next to Barbara's drink. W. Had is this? Frank asked, stepping forward. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning it. I watched Barbara. She didn't look at the paper. She looked at me, and for a split second the fear in her eyes was absolute. She knew exactly what it was. I found grandfather's journal, Mother, I said, my voice steady. I know about the boxes in the attic, the ones Leo saw. I know you were adopted from St. Jude S. in 1952. Frank let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. This is fake. This is some desperate Photoshop job you made to hurt her. You're pathetic, Izzy. It's a certified copy from the county records, I lied smoothly. And I have the original letter from Dad confirming it. So what? Barbara hissed, standing up. Her hands were shaking. So what if I was chosen? My father loved me. I am his daughter. That doesn't change anything. It changes everything, I said, locking eyes with her. Because you rejected my daughter, your granddaughter, last night. You told an 11-year-old girl that she was garbage because she didn't share your blood. You invoked the sanctity of the family line. I took a step closer. And then there's the trust. Sarah pulled the 1920 deed this morning, Frank, to the heirs of the body. That's the legal term. It means biological children only. Adopted children were explicitly excluded from the family fortune by great-grandfather Rutherford. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank lowered the paper, his face turning an ashen gray. He looked at Barbara. Mom, Frank said, his voice tight. Is that true? Does the trust exclude? It doesn't matter, Barbara shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. I have been the matriarch of this family for 40 years. I am a Rutherford. You are an ungrateful, jealous little girl trying to destroy your own mother because you can't control your bratty kids. You're projecting, Mother, I said coldly. You've been living a lie. You've been spending money that belongs to the heirs of the body. That's me. That's Frank. But not you. Technically, every cent you've spent since 1985 has been theft. Get out, Frank snarled, moving toward me. He wasn't the polished brother anymore. He was a cornered animal. Get the hell out of this house before I call the police. Call them, I challenged. I'd love to show them these documents. I'd love to explain why the Rutherford legacy is actually a fraud. Frank stopped. He knew he couldn't make that call. I'm leaving, I said, turning to the door. But this isn't over. You owe Zoe an apology, a public one. And if you ever speak to my children again with anything less than total respect, I will release these documents to the trust board. And you know what they'll do. I walked out, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had drawn blood, but I knew them. They wouldn't apologize, they would attack. I expected silence. I expected them to take a few days to regroup. I underestimated Frank's desperation. 2 days later, I was at work, deep in the archives of the basement, wearing white cotton gloves and sorting through a donation of Civil War letters. My supervisor, Mrs. Gable, came down the stairs, looking worried. Isabella, there's a man here to see you. He says he's your attorney, but he's very aggressive. My stomach dropped. I didn't have a male attorney. I took off my gloves and walked up to the lobby. Standing there, looking out of place among the display cases of Pioneer quilts, was Frank. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, but his eyes were red-rimmed. He looked like he hadn't slept. He wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a man I recognized, Mr. Henderson, the family's longtime lawyer. The man who managed the trust. Frank, I said, keeping my distance. Mr. Henderson, to what do I owe the pleasure? We need to talk, Isabella, Mr. Henderson said. He sounded tired. Privately. I led them into a small conference room and left the door open. Talk. We've seen the document you showed Frank, Mr. Henderson began, opening his briefcase. It is concerning. However, the validity of a 50-year-old adoption record in relation to the current trust structure is debatable. It's not debatable, I said. I had a trust litigator review the 1920 deed. It's ironclad, heirs of the body. Barbara isn't one. Mom is a wreck, Izzy, Frank interrupted, his voice dropping to a plea that sounded almost genuine. She's not eating, you've destroyed her. She destroyed a little girl's Christmas, I shot back. She destroyed my relationship with her years ago. I'm just finishing the job. Frank's face hardened. Look, we're prepared to offer you a settlement. We can amend the trust distribution. We can increase your monthly stipend. We can pay for the kids' college, fully funded, starting today. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement and turn over the original journal and the adoption paper. He slid a check across the table. It was for $50,000. I looked at the check. It was a lot of money. It was security. It was easy. But then I remembered Zoe's face. I remembered her blinking back tears, holding that ceramic bowl. I remembered Leo standing up, shaking with rage, to defend his sister. If I took this money, I was selling their dignity. I would be saying that Barbara's lie was worth more than my children's truth. Where is this money coming from, Frank? I asked softly. Is this from the trust that I am technically the sole heir to? Frank flinched. You're trying to pay me off with my own money, I realized. And you brought Mr. Henderson here to legitimize it. I looked at the lawyer. Does the trust board know about Barbara's parentage, Mr. Henderson, or have you been helping them hide it? Mr. Henderson snapped his briefcase shut. I think we're done here. I think we are, I said. Frank, you have until the New Year's Eve gala. That's 3 days away. If Mom hasn't made a public apology to Zoe and Leo by then, I'm going public. Not just to the board, to everyone. You wouldn't, Frank sneered. You'd humiliate the family name. You'd embarrass yourself. I'm not the one who should be embarrassed, I said. They left, storming out of the historical society like thunderclouds. I went back to my desk, but I couldn't work. I needed more than just the adoption paper. I needed to prove they knew. I needed to prove the malice. My phone pinged. It was Leo. Leo, Mom, I remember something else about the boxes. There was a ledger. It had payments listed. Payments to a St. Jude's home that continued until 1990. My breath hitched. 1990, 5 years after grandfather died. If Barbara continued to pay the orphanage, it wasn't a donation. It was hush money. I typed back, "Did you take a picture of the ledger?" 3 dots appeared, then an image loaded. It was a blurry photo taken in the dark attic, but the column of figures was clear. Check 405, sent Jude's admin's silence fee, $5,000. Silence fee, they had actually written it down. Frank hadn't just been protecting his mother's feelings. He and Barbara had been paying to keep the record buried. This wasn't just civil fraud anymore. This was criminal conspiracy. I forwarded the image to Sarah. "Sarah, oh my God. Izzy, this is the smoking gun. This proves intent to defraud the trust. If you show this, they don't just lose the house. They go to jail." I stared at the phone. I didn't want my mother in jail. I just wanted her to stop hurting us. But they had pushed me into a corner, and now I was holding a grenade. The New Year's Eve gala was the social event of the season. Barbara was the chairperson. She would be on stage, giving a speech about family values and tradition. I knew exactly where this had to end. The annual Rutherford New Year's Eve Gala was held, as it was every year, in the grand ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club. It was a place of polished marble, cascading crystal chandeliers, and people who measured their worth by the age of their scotch and the pedigree of their surnames. I pulled my old sedan up to the valet stand, right behind a line of Bentleys and Merceds. The valet, a young man named Kevin who had gone to high school with Leo, looked confused. "Mrs. Sterling, I didn't see you on the list tonight." "I'm a late addition, Kevin," I said, handing him the keys. My hands were shaking, but my voice was granite. I was wearing a black dress I hadn't worn in years, simple, severe, and sharp. I wasn't there to celebrate. I was there to officiate a funeral for a lie. I walked past the check-in table. The girl working the list tried to stop me, but I didn't even slow down. I walked with the kind of purpose that makes people instinctively step aside. I could hear the murmur of the crowd inside, the clink of glasses, the low hum of a string quartet playing Vivaldi. I pushed open the double doors. The room was bathed in golden light. There were at least 200 people there, the town's elite, the board members of the Historical Society, the trustees of the Rutherford fortune. And there, on the raised stage at the front of the room, stood Barbara. She looked magnificent in a shimmering silver gown that cost more than my annual salary. She held a microphone, basking in the adoration of the room. Frank stood just behind her, looking smug in his tuxedo, a glass of champagne in his hand. My father, Robert, sat at a table near the stage, looking small and tired. I stopped in the shadows of the entrance, listening. "And that is why heritage matters," Barbara was saying, her voice amplified and smooth. "It is the invisible thread that binds us. It is the purity of our history that gives us strength. In a world that is constantly changing, we must hold fast to our roots, to our blood." A ripple of polite applause moved through the room. "We protect our own," she continued, smiling that practiced, shark-like smile. "We ensure that the legacy passed down from my father, the great Jonathan Rutherford, remains untainted for future generations." I felt the envelope in my clutch purse. It felt hot, like a live coal. I started walking. I didn't walk to the side. I walked straight down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically on the parquet floor. People started to turn. Whispers hissed through the air like steam. "Is that Isabella? What is she doing? Look at her face." Barbara saw me when I was halfway to the stage. Her smile faltered, then froze. Frank took a step forward, his eyes widening in panic. He whispered something to her, but she was paralyzed, staring at me like I was a ghost. I didn't stop until I was standing at the foot of the stairs leading to the stage. The string quartet trailed off, sensing the tension. The room fell into a heavy, confused silence. "Isabella," Barbara said into the microphone, her voice tight. "We are in the middle of a toast. This is hardly the time." "Actually, Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly in the silent room, "I didn't need a microphone. It is the perfect time. You were just talking about heritage, about the purity of the Rutherford bloodline, about honesty." "Security," Frank barked, stepping to the edge of the stage. "Get her out of here, she's drunk." Two security guards started moving from the corners of the room, but I raised the large manila envelope in my hand. "I'm not drunk, Frank," I said, not looking at him. I kept my eyes locked on Barbara. "And I'm not leaving until we clarify the legacy you're so obsessed with. You told my daughter, your granddaughter, that she didn't belong in this family because she wasn't blood. You broke her heart to protect a standard that you claimed to uphold." I walked up the stairs. Frank moved to block me, but I sidestepped him and placed the envelope on the podium, right in front of Barbara. "Tell them," I said softly. "Get off this stage," Barbara hissed, the microphone catching the venom in her voice. "You ungrateful, jealous." "Tell them," I repeated, louder this time. I turned to the audience. I saw Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, standing near the back, his face pale. I saw the members of the trust board. My mother has spent the last 40 years preaching about the Rutherford bloodline. She has used it to belittle me, to exclude my children, and to justify her lavish lifestyle funded by the Rutherford Family Trust. I pulled the documents out of the envelope. I held up the blown-up photocopy of the 1952 adoption order. "This is an order of adoption," I announced. The gasps in the room were audible. Dated 1952, my mother, Barbara Ann, was adopted by Jonathan Rutherford. She is not his biological daughter. "That is a lie," Frank screamed, lunging for the paper. "She forged it." "It is a certified copy from the county records," I said, dodging him. "But that's not the crime, is it, Frank? Being adopted is not a crime. It's a blessing. I should know. I adopted my own daughter." I turned back to Barbara, who was trembling so violently the sequins on her dress shimmered like static. "The crime," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm, "is that the Rutherford Trust, the money that paid for this party, for this club, for your house, is strictly designated for heirs of the body. Biological descendants only. You knew this. Grandfather knew this. And instead of amending the trust legally, which might have reduced your share, you hid the truth." I pulled out the second photo, the picture of the ledger Leo had found. "And when you realized the truth might come out," I continued, "you used the trust's money to pay hush money to the orphanage. Silence fees. Conspiracy to commit fraud." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom crumbling. "You rejected Zoe because she wasn't blood," I said, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. "But you're the one who doesn't belong, Mother. By your own cruel logic, you are the fraud. You are the one who has been stealing from the family for decades." Barbara looked at the crowd. She looked for support, for someone to laugh it off, for the illusion to hold. But the faces staring back at her were cold. They were calculating. They were the faces of people who realized they had been worshipping a false idol. "Arthur," Barbara gasped, turning to my father. "Arthur, tell her to stop." My father stood up slowly. He looked at the woman he had been married to for 45 years. He looked at Frank, who was sweating and looking for an exit. Then he looked at me. For the first time in my life, I saw the fog clear from his eyes. He saw the cruelty. He saw the hypocrisy. He saw the daughter who had stood by him, and the son who was currently trying to figure out how to blame this on someone else. "You told me," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "You told me it was just a rumor. You told me the papers were lost." "Arthur, please," Barb. Ara begged, reaching for his arm. He pulled away. It was a small movement, but it was final. "You made me choose," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "Last night, you made me choose between you and my grandchildren. You made me sit there while you broke that little girl's heart." He looked at me. "I'm sorry, Isabella, I'm so sorry." Arthur turned and walked off the stage. He walked down the stairs, past the stunned crowd, and toward the exit. Barbara stood alone on the stage. The microphone fed back with a high-pitched whine. She looked small. She looked old. She looked completely and utterly defeated. "Happy New Year," I whispered to her. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the murmur of the crowd turning into a roar of judgment behind me. The fallout was not swift. It was a slow, grinding dismemberment of my mother's life. In the weeks that followed the gala, the Rutherford Trust Board launched a full forensic audit. Mr. Henderson was fired and reported to the Bar Association for his complicity. The evidence Leo and I had provided, the journal, the adoption decree, the ledger, was irrefutable. Because of the statute of limitations and my refusal to press criminal charges, Barbara and Frank avoided prison. I didn't want my mother in a cell. I just wanted her powerless. And powerless she became. The trust was frozen immediately. The life estate clause that allowed her to live in the mansion was voided due to the fraud. They were given 30 days to vacate. I drove by the house on the final day. Moving trucks were blocking the driveway. I saw Frank arguing with a mover about a scratched table. He looked disheveled, stripped of his arrogance. He had filed for bankruptcy the week prior. Without the trust acting as his safety net, his creditors had descended like vultures. Barbara was sitting on a stone bench near the fountain, watching the movers carry out her life. She was wearing a simple coat, not one of her furs. She looked up as I idled at the gate. We locked eyes for a moment across the distance. There was no hate in my heart anymore, just a profound, hollow pity. She had chosen a legacy of lies over the love of her family, and now she had neither. I didn't wave. I just rolled up the window and drove on. I drove to a small, bright house on the other side of town, a rental my father had moved into. When I walked inside, the atmosphere was completely different from the cold mausoleum I had grown up in. It was warm. It smelled of cinnamon and actual food, not catering. Zoe was sitting at the kitchen table, covered in paint. She was working on a new canvas, a vibrant explosion of colors. "Grandpa says the blue needs more yellow," she told me, pointing to the painting. My father, wearing a cardigan and looking 10 years younger than he had at Christmas, was standing over her shoulder, holding a mug of tea. He smiled when he saw me. It was a real smile, reaching his eyes. "It's true," he said. "The sun needs to be brighter." Leo was on the couch, reading a book. He looked up and gave me a nod. The anger that had lived in his shoulders since Christmas Eve was gone. He was just a kid again. "Did you see them?" Leo asked quietly. "I did," I said, putting my keys on the counter. "It's done. The house is empty." "Good," Leo said. He went back to his book. I walked over to Zoe and kissed the top of her head. "It's beautiful, baby." Zoe put down her brush and looked at me. Her eyes were clear. The shadow of Barbara's rejection had faded, replaced by the security of knowing that she was defended, she was chosen, and she was loved. "Mom," she asked. "Yeah." "Can we make a new tradition?" she asked, "for next Christmas?" I looked at my father, who was watching us with tears in his eyes. I looked at Leo, who was listening. "We can make whatever traditions we want," I said, hugging her tight. "That's the best thing about family, Zoe. It's not about whose blood you have. It's about who shows up when you need them. It's about who stays." I looked out the window at the winter sun setting over the trees. The Rutherford legacy of wealth and exclusion was dead. But in this small kitchen, with paint on the table and laughter in the air, a new legacy was just beginning. And this one was built on solid ground.